It's no secret that within the Beatles, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were often seen as the driving creative forces. But what about George Harrison? While Lennon and McCartney's partnership took center stage, Harrison was often left in the shadows. However, the dynamic between Lennon and Harrison was far more complex than it appeared on the surface. In today's video, we're going to dive deep into the relationship between these two legendary figures, how George Harrison often felt overshadowed by John Lennon during their time in the Beatles, and the later tensions that surfaced after the band's breakup. Let's go beyond the headlines and explore the real story behind their rivalry and friendship. George Harrison joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, when he was only 14 years old. John was nearly 3 years older than George and already established as the band's leader. At the time, Lennon had a reputation as the charismatic, rebellious figure who commanded attention. It was clear from the beginning that there was an age gap, and perhaps even more importantly, a maturity gap, that shaped the dynamic between John and George. John saw himself as the dominant creative force, and Harrison was relegated to the role of the kid in the band. As the Beatles started to take shape, with Paul McCartney joining the lineup, the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership solidified. George Harrison, though immensely talented as a guitarist, was not seen as an equal contributor in those early days. This set the stage for the long-standing feeling of being overshadowed that George would carry throughout his time in the band. The reality was that the Lennon-McCartney duo became the engine that drove the Beatles' early success, and for George, it wasn't easy to break into that inner circle. In the early 1960s, as Beatlemania took off, the Beatles were known primarily for their catchy, pop-rock tunes. John and Paul dominated the songwriting, contributing hit after hit. Harrison, meanwhile, struggled to get his compositions featured on their albums. His frustration grew as his creative abilities began to blossom, but he was often relegated to contributing just 1 or 2 tracks per album. It was a tough position for George. He was part of the biggest band in the world, yet it felt like he was constantly fighting for recognition, trying to carve out his space among two towering figures. But it wasn't just the music that fueled the tension. John Lennon's personality played a big part in how George felt. John was famously outspoken, witty, and often cutting in his remarks, and he wasn't shy about asserting his dominance in the band. George, in contrast, was more introverted and increasingly drawn to spirituality. As John became more politically active and vocal about his beliefs, particularly in the mid-1960s, George felt increasingly disconnected from Lennon's approach to life and art. Their personalities, once more aligned in their younger, rebellious days, were now diverging sharply. By 1965, with albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver*, the Beatles' music had begun to evolve. George was contributing more significantly, with songs like If I Needed Someone and Taxman, but the Lennon-McCartney machine still overshadowed his efforts. Even so, George's contributions were vital to the band's developing sound, incorporating more experimental and non-Western influences, particularly through his interest in Indian music and culture. He introduced the sitar on Norwegian Wood, a track from Rubber Soul*, marking one of the first times an Indian instrument was used in Western popular music. But despite these innovations, George still felt sidelined. His deeper interest in Eastern spirituality was often treated dismissively by John, even though Lennon briefly dabbled in it himself. Lennon, always one to have the last word, reportedly mocked George's spiritual quest as little more than a passing phase. The cracks in the Lennon-Harrison relationship became more visible during the recording of The White Album in 1968. Tensions between all members of the band were running high, but for George, the pressure of working with two dominant personalities like John and Paul was reaching a boiling point. He was growing increasingly frustrated with their dismissive attitudes toward his songs. One famous incident from the Let It Be sessions saw George sarcastically snap at Paul McCartney, saying, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all, whatever it is that will please you." But this wasn't just aimed at Paul. It was also directed at John, who often sidelined George's contributions as the band spiraled into internal conflict. In fact, during the Let It Be sessions, George briefly quit the band, walking out after a particularly heated argument. While he did return, it was clear that the Beatles were no longer the cohesive unit they once had been. John, too, was becoming increasingly distant, both emotionally and musically. His growing relationship with Yoko Ono further complicated his interactions with the other members of the band, including George. Lennon's sharp tongue and sometimes cruel humor only deepened the resentment that George was feeling, particularly since George's spiritual and artistic evolution was often the subject of John's barbs. When the Beatles finally broke up in 1970, it was both a relief and a new beginning for George. While Lennon and McCartney's split attracted most of the public's attention, George quietly launched his solo career. His first major release, All Things Must Pass*, was a massive commercial and critical success. It was a triple album that showed the world just how much George had been holding back during his time with the Beatles. Tracks like My Sweet Lord became instant classics, and the album's success helped to finally cement George's place as an artist in his own right. No longer the quiet Beatle, Harrison was proving he could stand toe-to-toe with Lennon and McCartney. But despite his solo success, George and John's relationship remained strained. In interviews, Lennon didn't hesitate to criticize Harrison's newfound fame. He even expressed jealousy over the acclaim that All Things Must Pass received, which, in his eyes, rivaled anything that he or Paul had released post-Beatles. In one particularly biting interview, John sarcastically remarked about George's autobiography complaining that it didn't mention him enough. George, in turn, was hurt by John's public jabs and his coldness. Their relationship seemed to be characterized by lingering resentment and unresolved issues. Despite these tensions, there were moments of reconciliation. In 1971, George organized the concert for Bangladesh, one of the first major charity concerts, and invited John to perform. Lennon initially agreed, but he later backed out after a disagreement with Yoko Ono, adding another layer of complexity to his relationship with George. Even after the Beatles, the presence of Yoko in John's life continued to create friction between him and the other band members. After Lennon's tragic murder in 1980, George expressed his grief, saying that he had lost a brother. Despite the rivalry and the occasional bitterness, there was a deep respect and love between the two. George's song, All Those Years Ago, released in 1981, was a tribute to John, reflecting the complicated emotions that George felt after his death. In the end, it was clear that the bond between John and George went far beyond music. It was a connection that spanned their entire adult lives. So, was George Harrison really overshadowed by John Lennon, or was their tension simply the result of two creative minds growing in different directions? While Lennon's personality certainly loomed large, it's clear that George was carving his own path, both during and after the Beatles. Their relationship was one of rivalry, respect, and, ultimately, a deep connection that persisted despite their disagreements. What do you think? Was George truly in Lennon's shadow, or did he rise above it in the end? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the relationship between John Lennon and George Harrison, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more celebrity timelines here on Timelines Unlocked.